Can you imagine being trapped, not by walls, but by an invisible enemy, a silent threat lurking within the very place you thought was safe? June 14, 1944, 23:17 hours. Camp Hereford, Texas. The air hung heavy with the smell of manure and the low thrum of cicadas. Sergeant Miller wiped the sweat from his brow, the Texas heat relentless even this late in the day. He'd been stationed here for almost a year, guarding German prisoners of war, and the monotony was starting to wear him down. The camp was a sprawling grid of barbed wire and wooden barracks, a temporary home for thousands of captured soldiers. Most of them were just kids, barely out of their teens, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. Miller had seen enough combat to know that war turned boys into men, and usually not for the better. Tonight, though, something was different. As he patrolled the perimeter fence, he noticed an unusual quiet in Barracks 4. It usually housed the most troublesome prisoners, a group of hardened veterans who never missed an opportunity to shout insults or stage minor acts of defiance. But tonight, they were silent, their windows dark. Miller frowned. He tightened his grip on his rifle and approached the barracks cautiously. He could hear faint sounds coming from inside, a low murmur that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the usual chatter or drunken singing. It was something else, something organized. He signaled to the guard in the watchtower, Private Johnson, who trained his searchlight on the barracks. The sudden beam of light seemed to have no effect. The murmuring continued unabated. Miller decided to investigate. He unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the smell of sweat and stale tobacco hitting him like a wall. The barracks were dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The prisoners were all in their bunks, but they weren't sleeping. They were sitting upright, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. Their lips moved silently as if they were reciting something in unison. Miller couldn't make out any words. It was just a low, hypnotic hum. "What's going on here?" Miller demanded, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. The prisoners didn't respond. They remained frozen in their positions, their eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Miller moved closer to one of them, a young man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. He reached out and shook him gently. "Hey, answer me," the prisoner blinked, his eyes focusing on Miller. For a moment, Miller thought he saw a flicker of recognition, but then the prisoner's eyes glazed over again, and he resumed his silent recitation. Frustrated, Miller grabbed another prisoner, a burly sergeant with a scar across his cheek. He shook him harder, but the sergeant didn't even flinch. He was completely unresponsive, lost in his own world. Miller felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a harmless prank. Something strange was happening here, something he didn't understand. He backed away from the bunks, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. As he scanned the room, his eyes fell on a small object lying on the floor near one of the bunks. It was a piece of metal, about the size of a coin, with strange symbols etched into its surface. Miller had never seen anything like it before. He bent down and picked it up, examining it closely. The metal was cold and smooth to the touch. The symbols were intricate and unfamiliar, a series of lines and curves that seemed to writhe before his eyes. Suddenly, one of the prisoners gasped, his body convulsing violently. He thrashed in his bunk, his eyes rolling back in his head. The other prisoners remained silent, their eyes still fixed on the unseen point. Miller dropped the metal object as if it had burned him. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of here. He rushed out of the barracks, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Private Johnson, who had witnessed the whole scene from the watchtower, rushed over to him, his face pale with fear. "What was that, Sergeant? What was going on in there?" Miller shook his head, unable to speak. He didn't know what he had just witnessed, but he knew it was something evil. He looked down at his hand where the metal object had been. There was a faint tingling sensation, as if the symbols had left an imprint on his skin. He had to find out what was going on. He had to find out what the prisoners were reciting, what the strange symbols meant, and why they were all acting so strangely. But he knew, deep down, that he was dealing with something far more sinister than he could ever have imagined. The next morning, Miller reported the incident to Captain Reynolds, the commanding officer of the camp. Reynolds listened patiently, but he seemed skeptical. "Sergeant, these men are prisoners of war. They're probably just bored and trying to stir up trouble. Don't let them get to you. Miller tried to explain what he had seen: the silent recitation, the unresponsive prisoners, the strange metal object. But Reynolds just waved his hand dismissively. I appreciate your concern, Sergeant, but I have more important things to worry about than the antics of a few bored prisoners. Just keep an eye on them and make sure they don't cause any trouble. Miller left Reynolds' office feeling frustrated and defeated. He knew that something was wrong, but no one seemed to believe him. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He started by questioning the other guards, asking them if they had noticed anything unusual about the prisoners in Barracks 4. Most of them just shrugged and said they hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. But one guard, a young corporal named Davis, admitted that he had heard strange noises coming from the barracks at night. I thought it was just them talking in their sleep, Davis said. But now that you mention it, it did sound kind of weird, like they were chanting or something. Miller felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't crazy after all. He asked Davis if he had seen anything else unusual. Davis hesitated for a moment, then said, "Well, there was one thing. A couple of nights ago, I saw one of the prisoners sneaking out of the barracks. He was carrying something under his coat. Did you see what it was?" Miller asked eagerly. Davis shook his head. "It was too dark, but it looked like a small box or something." Miller's mind raced. Could this be connected to the strange events in Barracks 4? He decided to investigate. He started by searching the barracks, looking for any clues that might shed light on the mystery. He searched every bunk, every locker, every corner of the room, but he found nothing. The barracks were clean and orderly, almost too perfect. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd about one of the bunks. The mattress seemed to be slightly out of place. He lifted the mattress and found a small wooden box hidden underneath. His heart pounded. Miller opened the box. Inside, he found a collection of strange objects: a small piece of bone, a lock of hair, a dried flower, and another one of the metal objects with the strange symbols. Miller stared at the objects in disbelief. What were these things? And what did they have to do with the prisoners in Barracks 4? He closed the box and took it back to his quarters. He spent the rest of the day studying the objects, trying to decipher the symbols on the metal pieces. He consulted books on ancient religions and occult practices, but he couldn't find anything that matched the symbols. As the days turned into weeks, the strange events in Camp Hereford continued to escalate. The prisoners in Barracks 4 became increasingly withdrawn and unresponsive. They stopped eating, stopped talking, and spent most of their time sitting in their bunks, staring blankly ahead. One morning, Miller found one of the prisoners dead in his bunk. There were no signs of violence, no apparent cause of death. The prisoner had simply died in his sleep. The camp doctor, a young lieutenant named Kelly, examined the body but couldn't find anything wrong. He ruled the death as a heart failure, but Miller wasn't convinced. He suspected that something more sinister was at play. He tried to talk to Captain Reynolds about his concerns, but Reynolds was dismissive. "Sergeant, these men are prisoners of war. They're not exactly living the high life. It's not surprising that one of them died. Just let it go." Miller refused to let it go. He knew that something terrible was happening in Camp Hereford, and he was determined to find out what it was. He decided to focus his investigation on the metal objects with the strange symbols. He reasoned that if he could decipher the symbols, he might be able to understand what was happening to the prisoners. He spent hours studying the symbols, comparing them to ancient alphabets and obscure religious texts. He even consulted a local professor who specialized in ancient languages, but the professor couldn't identify the symbols. Just when Miller was about to give up, he had a breakthrough. He was reading a book on cryptography when he noticed a similarity between the symbols and a type of ancient code. He spent the next several days working on the code, using his knowledge of mathematics and linguistics to try to crack it. Finally, he succeeded. The symbols weren't letters or numbers. They were a series of coordinates, geographical locations. Miller plotted the coordinates on a map of Texas. To his surprise, they all pointed to a single location, a deserted ranch about 50 miles west of Camp Hereford. Miller felt a surge of excitement. He had finally found a clue that might lead him to the truth. He decided to visit the ranch and see what he could find. He asked Captain Reynolds for permission to take a day trip, but Reynolds refused. "Sergeant, I need you here at the camp. I can't spare you for a joyride." Miller knew that he couldn't ask Reynolds again. He would have to go to the ranch on his own without permission. The next morning, he woke up before dawn and slipped out of the camp. He drove to the ranch in a borrowed Jeep, his heart pounding with anticipation. The ranch was deserted and overgrown, a collection of dilapidated buildings surrounded by miles of barren land. Miller felt a sense of foreboding as he approached the main house. It was dark and silent, its windows boarded up. He parked the Jeep and approached the house cautiously, his hand resting on his pistol. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He went around to the back of the house and found a window that was slightly ajar. He pried the window open and climbed inside. The house was dark and dusty, filled with the musty smell of decay. Miller pulled out his flashlight and began to search the rooms. He found nothing of interest in the main living areas. The furniture was old and broken, covered in cobwebs. The walls were bare, the wallpaper peeling. He moved on to the bedrooms. In one of the rooms, he found a diary lying on a bedside table. He picked it up and began to read. The diary was written in German, in a neat, elegant hand. Miller recognized the name of the author, Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt. One of the prisoners in Barracks 4. Miller read the diary with growing fascination. Schmidt was a highly educated man, a professor of ancient history and languages. He had been drafted into the German army against his will, and he had been captured by the Americans shortly after arriving in France. In his diary, Schmidt described his experiences in Camp Hereford. He wrote about the boredom, the loneliness, and the constant humiliation of being a prisoner of war. But he also wrote about something else, something far more disturbing. Schmidt believed that the camp was built on a site of ancient power, a place where the veil between the worlds was thin. He believed that the symbols on the metal objects were a key to unlocking that power. He wrote about his experiments with the other prisoners in Barracks 4, his attempts to use the symbols to contact the spirits of the dead. He believed that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that he was about to open a gateway to another dimension. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but Schmidt's words were chillingly convincing. He read on, eager to find out what happened next. In the final entry in the diary, Schmidt wrote that he had finally succeeded. He had opened the gateway, but he warned that the power he had unleashed was dangerous, that it could destroy the world if it fell into the wrong hands. Miller closed the diary, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to believe. Was Schmidt crazy? Or had he really opened a gateway to another dimension? He decided to search the rest of the house, looking for any evidence to support Schmidt's claims. He went down to the basement, a dark and damp space filled with cobwebs and strange shadows. In the corner of the basement, he found a locked door. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He kicked the door with all his might, but it remained closed. Frustrated, he went back upstairs and found an axe in the garage. He carried the axe back down to the basement and began to hack at the door. After several minutes of hard work, the door finally splintered open. Miller stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating a small, windowless room. The room was bare except for a single object, a large stone altar. The altar was covered in bloodstains, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Miller stared at the altar in horror. He realized that Schmidt hadn't just been contacting spirits. He had been sacrificing people. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth. He had to get out of here. He turned and ran out of the room, out of the basement, out of the house. He jumped into the Jeep and sped away, leaving the deserted ranch behind him. He drove back to Camp Hereford, his mind racing. He had to tell Captain Reynolds what he had found. He had to stop Schmidt before he could do any more harm. He burst into Reynolds' office, his face pale and his voice trembling. "Captain, you have to listen to me. Schmidt is a madman. He's been sacrificing people. He's opened a gateway to another dimension." Reynolds stared at Miller in disbelief. "Sergeant, are you drunk?" "What are you talking about?" Miller tried to explain what he had found at the ranch, but Reynolds wouldn't listen. "Sergeant, I think you need to see a doctor. You're clearly not thinking straight." Miller realized that he wasn't going to get through to Reynolds. He would have to take matters into his own hands. he decided to arrest Schmidt himself. He gathered a group of loyal guards and stormed into Barracks 4. Schmidt was sitting in his bunk, staring blankly ahead. He didn't resist as Miller and the guards dragged him out of the barracks. They took Schmidt to the camp's interrogation room and chained him to a chair. Miller stood before him, his eyes filled with anger and determination. "Schmidt, you're under arrest for murder and treason. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Schmidt didn't respond. He just stared blankly ahead, a faint smile playing on his lips. Miller leaned closer to Schmidt, his voice low and menacing. "Why did you do it, Schmidt? Why did you sacrifice those people?" Schmidt finally spoke, his voice a low whisper. "I did it for the glory of the fatherland. I did it to unlock the power that lies hidden beneath this land." "What power?" Miller demanded. "What are you talking about?" "The power to destroy our enemies," Schmidt said. "The power to rule the world." Miller stared at Schmidt in disbelief. He was completely insane. He decided to try a different approach. He showed Schmidt the metal objects with the strange symbols. "Do you recognize these, Schmidt? What do they mean?" Schmidt's eyes lit up. "The keys," he exclaimed. "The keys to the gateway." He reached out to touch the objects, but Miller pulled them away. "What gateway, Schmidt? Where does it lead?" Schmidt smiled. "It leads to a place of unimaginable power," he said. "A place where the dead walk and the living fear to tread." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that Schmidt was telling the truth. He had opened a gateway to another dimension, a dimension filled with darkness and evil. He had to stop him, but he didn't know how. Suddenly, the lights in the interrogation room flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Miller heard a scream, followed by a sickening thud. He fumbled for his pistol, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights flickered back on. Miller stared in horror at what he saw. Schmidt was gone. The chains that had held him to the chair were broken. Lying on the floor was one of the guards, his throat slashed. Miller realized that Schmidt had escaped. He was loose in the camp, and he was more dangerous than ever. He gathered the remaining guards and began to search the camp, but Schmidt was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As the hours passed, Miller's desperation grew. He knew that Schmidt was planning something terrible. He had to find him before it was too late. Suddenly, one of the guards came running towards him, his face pale with fear. "Sergeant, we found something. You have to see it." Miller followed the guard to the camp's mess hall. The mess hall was empty, the tables and chairs neatly arranged. But something was different. Miller noticed a strange symbol painted on the wall above the entrance to the kitchen. It was the same symbol that was etched on the metal objects. He felt a surge of dread. He knew that Schmidt was in the kitchen. He drew his pistol and approached the kitchen cautiously. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The kitchen was dark and steamy, filled with the smell of stale food. Miller scanned the room, his eyes searching for any sign of Schmidt. He saw something moving in the shadows. He raised his pistol and fired. A figure fell to the ground, groaning in pain. Miller rushed over and saw that it was the camp cook, a portly man named Johnson. "Johnson, what are you doing here?" Miller demanded. Johnson looked up at Miller, his eyes filled with fear. "He made me do it, Sergeant. He made me do it." "Who made you do what?" Miller asked impatiently. "Schmidt," Johnson said. "He made me poison the food." Miller stared at Johnson in horror. "Poison the food? What kind of poison?" "A special kind," Johnson said. "A poison that will open their minds. A poison that will make them susceptible to his control." Miller realized what Schmidt was planning. He was going to poison the entire camp, turning the prisoners and the guards into his mindless slaves. He had to stop him, but he didn't know how. The food was already poisoned. It was too late. Then he noticed something else. Lying on the floor near Johnson was a small vial filled with a clear liquid. Miller picked it up and examined it closely. He recognized the liquid. It was the same substance that Schmidt had used to open the gateway at the ranch. Miller's mind raced. He realized that Schmidt wasn't just planning to control the camp. He was planning to open another gateway right here in the mess hall. He had to stop him, but he was running out of time. The prisoners and the guards were already starting to eat the poisoned food. He knew that he had to act fast. He grabbed Johnson and dragged him towards the door. "Where is he, Johnson? Where is Schmidt?" Johnson pointed towards the back of the kitchen. "He's in the pantry, Sergeant. He's waiting for the poison to take effect." Miller pushed Johnson aside and rushed towards the pantry. He kicked open the door and stepped inside. The pantry was small and cramped, filled with shelves of canned goods and sacks of flour. Standing in the center of the room was Schmidt, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. In front of Schmidt was a large circle drawn on the floor with chalk. Inside the circle were the metal objects with the strange symbols. Schmidt was chanting in a low, guttural voice. The air crackled with energy. Miller raised his pistol and aimed it at Schmidt's head. "It's over, Schmidt. You're under arrest." Schmidt stopped chanting and looked up at Miller, a smile playing on his lips. "It's not over, Sergeant. It's just beginning." Suddenly, the ground began to shake. The shelves in the pantry rattled. The canned goods fell to the floor. The circle on the floor began to glow. A vortex of light swirled above him. Miller realized that Schmidt was about to open the gateway. He had to stop him, but he didn't know how. He fired his pistol, aiming for Schmidt's head. But Schmidt raised his hand, and a bolt of energy shot out, deflecting the bullet. The vortex of light grew larger and brighter. The air crackled with electricity. Miller knew that he was out of time. He had to do something drastic. He looked down at the vial of liquid in his hand. It was the same substance that Schmidt had used to open the gateway. He knew that it was dangerous, but he had no other choice. He uncorked the vial and took a deep breath. He threw the liquid into the vortex of light. The vortex exploded in a blinding flash. The pantry was filled with a deafening roar. Miller felt a searing pain coursing through his body. He collapsed to the floor, his vision blurring. He heard Schmidt screaming in agony. Then everything went black. He didn't know how long he was unconscious. When he finally woke up, he was lying on the floor of the pantry. The pantry was silent and still. The shelves were empty. The circle on the floor was gone. Schmidt was gone too. Miller struggled to his feet, his body aching. He looked around the pantry, trying to make sense of what had happened. He saw something lying on the floor near where Schmidt had been standing. It was a small notebook. He picked it up and opened it. It was Schmidt's personal journal. He started to read. The entries were written in a strange code, but Miller recognized it. It was the same code that was used in the metal objects. He began to decipher the code. As he read, his blood ran cold. Schmidt's journal wasn't just a record of his experiments. It was a list of names, the names of people who were destined to die. Miller flipped to the last page of the journal. There was only one name written there, Captain Reynolds. And beneath Reynolds' name, in even darker ink, was a single word: tomorrow. Did you like it? Leave your comment and tell us if you've ever heard any interesting stories about World War II. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the most intriguing stories. Miller stared at the name scrawled in Schmidt's journal, Captain Reynolds, followed by that single chilling word, tomorrow. A wave of nausea washed over him, colder and more potent than anything he'd felt in that cursed pantry. He knew what Schmidt intended. He wasn't just planning an escape or even a simple act of revenge. He was enacting a ritual, fulfilling a dark prophecy written in blood and whispered in shadows. He had to warn Reynolds, but the captain had already dismissed him as unstable, delusional. How could he convince him of the imminent danger when Reynolds already believed him to be insane? Camp Hereford, normally a place of stifled resentment and simmering tensions, now felt like a powder keg about to explode. Miller knew he was the only one who could prevent it, but he was alone, armed with knowledge that seemed too insane to be true. He ran from the mess hall, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. The faces of the other guards seemed different, their eyes holding a blankness that mirrored the vacant stares of the prisoners in Barracks 4. Had the poison already taken effect? Were they already under Schmidt's control, their minds mere puppets dancing to his infernal tune? He couldn't trust anyone. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He couldn't simply barge into Reynolds' office and shout about dark prophecies and possessed prisoners. He needed proof, something tangible that would shatter the captain's skepticism. He thought back to the ranch, to the altar stained with blood, to the chilling aura of that forsaken place. There had to be something there that he had missed, something that could solidify his claims and force Reynolds to listen. But time was running out. Tomorrow. That single word echoed in his mind, a death knell tolling for Captain Reynolds. He raced towards the motor pool, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He needed a vehicle, and he needed to get back to that ranch before sunrise. He spotted Corporal Davis, the young guard who had admitted to hearing strange noises coming from Barracks 4. Davis was tinkering with the engine of a jeep, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Davis," Miller barked, startling the young corporal. "I need a jeep now." Davis looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Sergeant, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "No time to explain," Miller said, his voice urgent. "Reynolds' life is in danger. I need to get back to the ranch." Davis hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Take this one, Sergeant. I just finished tuning it up. She's ready to roll." Miller didn't waste any time. He jumped into the jeep, started the engine, and sped out of the motor pool, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. As he drove through the camp gates, he noticed that the guard on duty, Sergeant Thompson, was acting strangely. His movements were jerky and unnatural, and his eyes were fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Miller shivered. The poison was working. He pushed the jeep to its limits, the engine roaring as he sped down the deserted highway. The Texas landscape blurred past him, the darkness broken only by the pale glow of the moon. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He had to reach the ranch, find the proof he needed, and save Reynolds before it was too late. He arrived at the ranch just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten in the east. The house loomed before him, a dark and ominous silhouette against the pale horizon. He parked the jeep and approached the house cautiously, his pistol drawn. The air was still and silent, heavy with the scent of decay. He entered the house through the same window he had used before, his senses on high alert. The interior was even more unsettling in the dim light of dawn. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, playing tricks on his eyes. He made his way to the basement, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the altar was the key, the focal point of Schmidt's dark rituals. He reached the locked door and kicked it open, his eyes scanning the room. The altar was still there, stained with blood and surrounded by an aura of malevolent energy. But something was different. There were symbols carved into the floor around the altar, symbols that he hadn't noticed before. They were intricate and complex, a series of geometric patterns that seemed to vibrate with power. He knelt down and examined the symbols more closely. He recognized them from Schmidt's journal. They were part of the code that he had been deciphering. He realized that they weren't just decorative. They were part of a ritual, a summoning spell. Schmidt had used them to open the gateway, and he was planning to use them again, this time with Reynolds as the sacrifice. He searched the room frantically, looking for anything that could help him understand the ritual. He found a small wooden chest hidden beneath the altar. He opened it and found a collection of strange objects: bones, hair, dried flowers, and several more of the metal objects with the symbols. He also found a map, a detailed drawing of Camp Hereford with a circle drawn around Reynolds' quarters. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. He had found the proof he needed. He grabbed the chest and the map and raced out of the house, jumping into the jeep and speeding back towards Camp Hereford. As he drove, he studied the map, trying to understand Schmidt's plan. He realized that the circle around Reynolds' quarters wasn't just a target. It was a focal point, a place where the gateway could be opened. Schmidt wasn't planning to kill Reynolds in his bed. He was planning to use him as a sacrifice to open a portal, to unleash something terrible upon the world. Miller gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had to stop him, but he knew that it wouldn't be easy. Schmidt was powerful, and he had the entire camp under his control. He arrived back at Camp Hereford just as the sun was beginning to rise. The camp seemed eerily quiet, the usual sounds of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. He drove straight to Reynolds' office, his heart pounding in his chest. He parked the jeep and ran inside, bursting through the door without knocking. Reynolds was sitting at his desk, reading a document. He looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "Sergeant Miller, what is the meaning of this? I told you to stay away from me." Miller ignored Reynolds' anger. He slammed the chest and the map onto the desk. "Captain, you're in danger. Schmidt is planning to kill you. He's going to use you as a sacrifice to open a gateway to another dimension." Reynolds stared at Miller in disbelief. "Sergeant, you're completely out of your mind. I'm going to have you arrested." "Captain, please, you have to listen to me," Miller pleaded. "I found this at the ranch. It's Schmidt's journal. He's planning to sacrifice you tomorrow." Miller shoved the journal across the desk towards Reynolds. Reynolds hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and began to read. As he read, his face grew pale. He looked up at Miller, his eyes wide with fear. "What is this, Sergeant? What does it mean?" "It means that Schmidt is insane, Captain," Miller said. "He believes that he can open a gateway to another dimension by sacrificing you. We have to stop him now." Reynolds nodded, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" "We gather the loyal guards and arrest Schmidt," Miller said. "We have to find him before he can carry out his plan." Reynolds hesitated. "But how do we know who we can trust? What if the poison has already taken effect?" "We have to take that chance, Captain," Miller said. "We have no other choice." Reynolds nodded, his face grim. "All right, Sergeant, let's do it." They gathered the guards they believed they could trust and stormed into Barracks 4, but Schmidt wasn't there. The barracks were empty, the prisoners gone. A wave of dread washed over Miller. Where was he? What was he planning? Suddenly, one of the guards shouted, "Sergeant, look!" He pointed towards the center of the barracks. A circle had been drawn on the floor, identical to the one Miller had seen in the pantry. The metal objects with the symbols were arranged around the circle. Miller realized what Schmidt was planning. He wasn't going to sacrifice Reynolds in his quarters. He was going to sacrifice him here in the barracks in front of all the prisoners. He wanted them to witness the opening of the gateway to become part of his twisted ritual. "He's going to bring Reynolds here," Miller said. "We have to stop him before he gets here." They spread out through the camp, searching for Schmidt and Reynolds. They searched the mess hall, the motor pool, the supply depot, but they found nothing. The camp was deserted, the silence broken only by the sound of their own footsteps. As they searched, Miller noticed that the sky was growing darker. A storm was brewing, the clouds gathering overhead. The wind began to howl and the air crackled with electricity. Miller felt a sense of foreboding. The storm wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was a sign, a manifestation of the dark power that Schmidt was about to unleash. Suddenly, one of the guards shouted, "Sergeant, I see them. They're heading towards the barracks." Miller and the other guards raced towards the barracks. As they approached, they saw Schmidt leading Reynolds across the courtyard. Reynolds was bound and gagged, his face pale with terror. Schmidt was chanting in a low, guttural voice, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Miller raised his pistol and fired, aiming for Schmidt's head. But Schmidt raised his hand and a bolt of energy shot out, deflecting the bullet. The storm intensified, the wind howling and the lightning flashing. The air crackled with electricity. Schmidt reached the barracks and dragged Reynolds inside. Miller and the other guards followed, their pistols drawn. They entered the barracks and saw Schmidt standing in the center of the circle, Reynolds lying bound and gagged at his feet. The prisoners were gathered around the circle, their eyes fixed on Schmidt, their faces blank and expressionless. Schmidt raised his arms and began to chant louder, his voice echoing through the barracks. The circle on the floor began to glow brighter. The air crackled with energy. Miller knew that he had to act fast or it would be too late. He charged towards Schmidt, his pistol raised. But as he got closer, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Standing behind Schmidt, their faces hidden in the shadows, were several women. One of them was Nurse Hoffman, the woman who had been tending to the prisoners in Barracks 4. Another was the camp cook, Mrs. Johnson, the woman who had poisoned the food. And the third was a woman he had never seen before, a woman with long black hair and piercing blue eyes. They were all chanting along with Schmidt, their voices adding to the growing crescendo of power. Miller realized that they weren't just helping Schmidt, they were part of the ritual. They were the keys, the conduits through which the dark energy was flowing. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He couldn't shoot Schmidt without risking hitting Reynolds, and he couldn't get past the women without being killed. He was trapped, caught in a web of dark magic and ancient rituals. Suddenly, the woman with the long black hair stepped forward. She looked at Miller, her blue eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. She raised her hand, and a bolt of energy shot out, striking Miller in the chest. He was thrown backward, crashing to the floor. As he lay there, gasping for breath, he saw the circle on the floor glowing brighter and brighter. The air crackled with electricity. The prisoners began to chant louder, their voices rising to a deafening roar. Schmidt raised his arms and shouted a single word, a word that echoed through the barracks and sent a shiver down Miller's spine. Earthnet, open. The ground began to shake. The walls of the barracks began to crumble. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur. A vortex of light opened up in the center of the circle, a swirling mass of energy that seemed to suck everything into it. Miller watched in horror as the prisoners were pulled into the vortex, their bodies disappearing one by one. He saw Reynolds struggling against his bonds, his eyes wide with terror. He saw Schmidt smiling, his face illuminated by the unholy light. The vortex grew larger and brighter, threatening to consume everything in its path. Miller knew that he had to do something, or they would all be lost. He struggled to his feet, his body aching. He looked around, searching for something, anything that could help him. He saw the woman with the long black hair standing near the vortex, her eyes fixed on Schmidt. She seemed to be in a trance, her body swaying back and forth. He realized that she was the key to closing the gateway, the only one who could stop Schmidt. He ran towards her, his pistol raised. But as he got closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The woman's face began to change, her features twisting and contorting. Her skin turned pale and translucent. Her eyes grew larger and wider, filling with a black, bottomless void. She was no longer human. She was something else, something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for centuries to be unleashed upon the world. She turned towards Miller, her eyes burning with an unholy light. She opened her mouth and a voice came out, a voice that was not her own, a voice that was ancient and powerful and filled with unspeakable malice. "You cannot stop us," the voice said. "The gateway is open, and the darkness will consume all." Miller stared at the woman in horror, his mind reeling. He realized that he had been wrong all along. Schmidt wasn't in control. He was just a pawn, a puppet being manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension. The woman raised her hand, and a bolt of energy shot out, striking Miller in the chest. He was thrown backward, crashing to the floor. As he lay there, gasping for breath, he saw the vortex growing larger and brighter. He saw the darkness pouring out, spreading across the barracks, consuming everything in its path. He knew that it was over. He had failed. He had tried to stop Schmidt, but he had only made things worse. He had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now the world would pay the price. As the darkness closed in, he saw the face of Captain Reynolds, his eyes filled with terror and despair. He saw the faces of the prisoners, their bodies twisted and contorted by the unholy light. He saw the faces of the women, their eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. And then everything went black. But even in the darkness, he could still hear the chanting, the voices rising to a deafening roar. And he could still feel the presence of something ancient and evil, something that was now free to roam the earth, something that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his days. Weeks later, Camp Hereford was a ghost town. The prisoners were gone, the guards were gone, and the camp was abandoned, left to rot in the Texas heat. The only sign that anything had ever happened there was the circle in Barracks 4, the circle that had opened the gateway to another dimension. The Army launched an investigation, but they found nothing. They couldn't explain what had happened to the prisoners or the guards or Captain Reynolds. They couldn't explain the circle in Barracks 4, or the strange symbols, or the reports of unearthly phenomena. They closed the case, labeling it as unexplained and sweeping it under the rug. They didn't want anyone to know what had happened at Camp Hereford, what horrors had been unleashed upon the world. But the truth was still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. And one day, someone would find it. Someone would uncover the secrets of Camp Hereford, and they would learn the truth about what happened there. But until then, the darkness would remain, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the opportunity to rise again. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of the world, a woman with long black hair opened her eyes. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. The plan had worked. The gateway was open, and the darkness was free. It all started as a file among hundreds of others. A simple note, disregarded, tucked away in the archives of military intelligence. A note mentioning strange occurrences at a prisoner of war camp in Texas. Camp Hereford, a name that would soon become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The file, marked confidential, detailed a series of bizarre events that began in the summer of 1944. Reports of unusual behavior among the prisoners, strange symbols and whispers of ancient rituals. But the most disturbing element was the disappearance of Captain Reynolds, the commanding officer of the camp. vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions. The Army dismissed the reports as the product of stressed minds and wartime paranoia. But one man, a young historian named Dr. Alan Grant, couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. He stumbled upon the file while researching military intelligence during World War II. The details of the case gripped him, the mystery pulling him deeper into a rabbit hole of secrets and lies. He saw a pattern, a connection between the strange events at Camp Hereford and something far more ancient, far more terrifying. He started his own investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind the disappearances and the whispers of dark magic. His research led him to obscure texts, forgotten languages, and whispers of a secret society that had been operating in the shadows for centuries. A society obsessed with unlocking the power of ancient gods and opening gateways to other dimensions. The more he learned, the more he realized that Camp Hereford wasn't just a prisoner of war camp. It was a nexus point, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where the forces of darkness could easily break through. He discovered that the prisoners weren't just soldiers, they were chosen vessels, pawns in a game far grander and more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. And the woman with the long black hair, she wasn't just a woman. She was a conduit, a vessel for an ancient entity that had been waiting for centuries to be unleashed upon the world. But Dr. Grant's investigation was just beginning. He knew that he was on the verge of uncovering something that could shatter the foundations of reality. And he knew that he was not alone in his pursuit. There were others who knew the truth about Camp Hereford, others who were determined to keep its secrets buried, and they would stop at nothing to silence him. As Dr. Grant delved deeper into the mystery, he began to receive strange warnings, cryptic messages that urged him to abandon his investigation. He was followed, watched, his every move scrutinized. He knew that he was walking a dangerous path, that he was playing with forces he didn't understand. But he couldn't stop. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. His research led him to a small town in Texas, a town not far from the abandoned site of Camp Hereford. A town where the locals whispered stories of strange occurrences, of dark rituals and unholy sacrifices. A town where the past refused to stay buried. He met an old woman, a descendant of one of the original settlers of the area. She told him stories of the ranch, the same ranch Miller had visited, and a dark presence that had haunted the land for generations. She spoke of a curse, a blood debt that had to be paid. She warned him to stay away, to leave the past undisturbed. But Dr. Grant wouldn't listen. He was too close to the truth to turn back now. He visited the abandoned ranch, the same ranch where Miller had found Schmidt's journal. He felt a chilling presence, a sense of unease that settled deep in his bones. He searched the house, the basement, the altar, but he found nothing. The house was empty, the past seemingly erased. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something strange. A small symbol etched into the stone floor beneath the altar. A symbol that he recognized from his research. A symbol that was said to open the gateway to another dimension. He knelt down and touched the symbol, a wave of energy coursing through his body. He felt a presence, a dark and malevolent force that seemed to be reaching out to him. He quickly pulled his hand away, a sense of dread washing over him. He knew that he was in danger, that he had stumbled upon something that he couldn't control. He left the ranch, his mind racing. He had to find a way to stop the darkness, to close the gateway before it was too late. He returned to his hotel room, exhausted and shaken. He sat down at his desk and began to review his notes, searching for a clue, a solution. He pored over the translated pages of Schmidt's journal, trying to decipher the true meaning of the rituals, the symbols. And then he saw it, a passage that he had overlooked before, a passage that spoke of a failsafe, a way to close the gateway if it ever became necessary. But the passage was incomplete, the final steps missing. He needed to find the missing pieces to unlock the secrets of the failsafe. But where could he find them? He thought back to the old woman in the town, the one who had told him the stories of the ranch. She had mentioned a hidden archive, a place where the town's history was preserved, a place that might hold the key to unlocking the failsafe. He knew that he had to find that archive to uncover the secrets that it held. But he also knew that he was running out of time. The darkness was growing stronger, the gateway was widening, and the woman with the long black hair was waiting for the moment when she could unleash her full power upon the world. He looked out the window, the sky growing dark. A storm was brewing, the clouds gathering overhead. The wind began to howl and the air crackled with electricity. He felt a sense of foreboding. The storm wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a sign, a manifestation of the dark power that was about to be unleashed. Tomorrow, Captain Reynolds was supposed to die. In the chilling context of what Miller had just discovered, the implications went far beyond a simple murder. The ritual sacrifice would amplify the gateway that Schmidt and his allies planned to open at Camp Hereford. Reynolds had to be warned and fast. Miller found the captain pacing anxiously in his office, clutching Schmidt's journal like a lifeline. "What do we do?" Reynolds asked, his voice tight with fear. "We move you," Miller said, his mind racing. "We get you out of your quarters, out of the camp. Anywhere is safer than here." Reynolds shook his head. "We can't just run. What about the other men, the prisoners, the guards? They're all in danger." "We'll evacuate the camp," Miller decided. "Tell everyone there's a security threat, a possible gas leak. We get them all to the far side of the perimeter." As they moved, getting the evacuation underway, Miller felt a knot of unease tightening his stomach. Something wasn't right. The camp was too quiet. There should have been chaos, confusion, but there was only a chilling stillness. The prisoners moved with unnerving docility, their faces blank, their eyes vacant. "They are under his control," Miller realized, his voice a low growl. "The poison, it's made them his puppets. What about the guards?" Reynolds asked, his eyes scanning the faces of the men around them. "Who can we trust?" Miller hesitated. "I don't know. We have to assume that anyone who's eaten the food is compromised." That limited their options drastically. Miller quickly assessed the guards he felt he could still rely on, men who had been on duty elsewhere, men who had skipped meals, a handful at best. It wouldn't be enough to fight off an entire camp of possessed prisoners. "We need to isolate Schmidt," Miller said. "Cut him off from his power source." "How do we do that?" Reynolds asked. "He's like a ghost. He could be anywhere." Miller had a plan, a desperate gamble. "He needs the circle," Miller said. "The one in the barracks, that's where he draws his power. We destroy it." Under cover of the evacuation, Miller and his small group of loyal guards made their way to Barracks 4. The storm outside raged, mirroring the turmoil within him. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his pistol raised. The barracks were empty, the circle on the floor glowing with an eerie light. "He's not here," Reynolds said, his voice filled with disappointment. "He's close," Miller replied, his senses on high alert. "He can't be far." As if on cue, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the barracks into darkness. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the air, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. "What was that?" Reynolds cried, his voice trembling. Miller fumbled for his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. He switched it on and pointed it towards the source of the sound. One of the guards lay dead on the floor, his throat slashed. Standing over him, bathed in the eerie glow of the circle, was Schmidt. "You can't stop me," Schmidt said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "The gateway will be open." "Not if I can help it," Miller said, raising his pistol. Schmidt laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "You're too late. The ritual has already begun." As he spoke, the circle on the floor began to spin, faster and faster. The air crackled with energy, and the temperature in the barracks dropped dramatically. The remaining guards opened fire, bullets whizzing past Schmidt, but he seemed impervious to them, protected by some unseen force. Miller knew that they were outmatched. They couldn't defeat Schmidt with conventional weapons. They needed to destroy the circle, to cut off his power source. He grabbed a fire axe from the wall and charged towards the circle, ignoring the bullets that flew past his head. Just as he reached the circle, Schmidt raised his hand and unleashed a bolt of energy, striking Miller in the chest. He was thrown backward, the fire axe flying from his grasp. He landed hard on the floor, gasping for breath. As he lay there, struggling to get up, he saw Schmidt raise his hands towards the vortex in the center of the circle. "Now," Schmidt cried, "the time has come. The gateway will be open." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Nurse Hoffman, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light. She moved with unnatural speed, grabbing Schmidt from behind and plunging a syringe into his neck. Schmidt screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound. He stumbled backward, his body convulsing violently. The vortex in the center of the circle flickered and died. The circle on the floor went dark. Nurse Hoffman released Schmidt, and he collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The storm outside began to subside, the wind dying down, the lightning fading. The barracks fell silent. Miller stared at Nurse Hoffman in disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did you do that?" Nurse Hoffman turned to face him, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and determination. "Because this had to stop," she said. Before it was too late, she approached Miller and offered him a hand. He took it and she helped him to his feet. "What was all this about?" Miller asked. "What was Schmidt trying to do?" "He was trying to open a gateway to another dimension," Nurse Hoffman said. "A dimension of darkness and chaos. He believed that he could harness its power to rule the world." "But why?" Miller asked. "Why would he want to do that?" "He was driven by a twisted ideology," Nurse Hoffman said. "He believed that the world was corrupt, that it needed to be cleansed by fire. He saw himself as a savior, a messiah who would usher in a new era of darkness." "And what about you?" Miller asked. "What's your role in all of this?" Nurse Hoffman hesitated. "I'm part of a secret organization," she said. "We've been fighting against groups like Schmidt's for centuries. We're the guardians of the gate, the protectors of humanity." Miller stared at her in disbelief. He had stumbled into a world of secret societies, ancient rituals, and interdimensional warfare. It was all too much to comprehend. "What happens now?" he asked. "Is it over?" Nurse Hoffman shook her head. "No," she said. "It's far from over. Schmidt was just one piece of the puzzle. There are others out there, others who are working to open the gateway. We have to stop them." "How?" Miller asked. "How can we fight against something like that?" "We need to find the key," Nurse Hoffman said. "The key to closing the gateway for good." "What key?" Miller asked. "Where do we find it?" Nurse Hoffman looked at him, her eyes filled with a sense of urgency. "It's hidden somewhere in this camp," she said. "Schmidt knew about it. That's why he was here. We have to find it before they do." "Who's they?" Miller asked. Before Nurse Hoffman could answer, a deafening explosion rocked the barracks. The walls crumbled, the roof collapsed, and the entire building was engulfed in flames. Miller and Nurse Hoffman were thrown clear of the wreckage, landing hard on the ground. They looked up and saw the camp engulfed in flames, explosions erupting all around them. "What's happening?" Miller cried. "Be attacking," Nurse Hoffman said. "They know we stopped Schmidt. They're trying to destroy the camp, to erase all evidence of what happened here. We have to get out of here," Miller said. "We have to find the key." They ran through the burning camp, dodging explosions and avoiding falling debris. They made their way to Reynolds' office, hoping to find some clue, some indication of where the key might be hidden. The office was in ruins, the walls collapsed, the furniture overturned. Reynolds was nowhere to be seen. "Reynolds," Miller shouted, his voice hoarse. "Reynolds, where are you?" There was no answer. They searched the office frantically, but they found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Nurse Hoffman spotted something. A small wooden box hidden beneath a pile of rubble. She pulled it out and opened it. Inside, they found a single object, a small metal disc etched with strange symbols. Miller recognized the disc. It was one of the objects that Schmidt had used in his rituals. "What is it?" he asked. "What does it do?" "I don't know," Nurse Hoffman said. "But I have a feeling it's important." Suddenly, they heard a voice behind them. Looking for something, they turned around and saw the woman with the long black hair standing in the doorway. Her eyes were glowing with an unearthly light. "You can't stop us," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. "The gateway will be opened, and the darkness will consume all." She raised her hand, and a bolt of energy shot out, striking Nurse Hoffman in the chest. Nurse Hoffman cried out and fell to the ground, lifeless. Miller stared at the woman in horror, his mind reeling. He was alone, facing a powerful and ancient evil. He knew that he couldn't defeat her, but he couldn't let her win. He looked down at the metal disc in his hand. He didn't know what it was or what it could do, but he knew that it was his only hope. He closed his eyes and focused all his energy on the disc. He felt a surge of power coursing through his body. He opened his eyes and looked at the woman. He raised the disc and pointed it at her. "Get away from here," he said, his voice trembling. "Leave this place and never come back." The woman laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "You can't threaten me," she said. "I'm beyond your comprehension." She raised her hand and unleashed another bolt of energy, but this time Miller was ready. He held up the disc and the energy was absorbed harmlessly. The woman stared at Miller in disbelief. "What is that thing?" she asked. "What are you doing?" "I'm stopping you," Miller said. "I'm closing the gateway." He raised the disc higher and began to chant, reciting the words that he had memorized from Schmidt's journal. The disc began to glow brighter and brighter. The air crackled with energy. The woman screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound. She stumbled backward, her face contorting in pain. "No," she cried. "You can't do this. You can't stop us." Miller continued to chant, his voice growing louder and more powerful. The disc glowed even brighter, bathing the room in an unearthly light. The woman began to dissolve, her body fading away, piece by piece. Finally, with a final scream, she vanished completely. The light faded and the room fell silent. Miller lowered the disc, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had stopped the woman. He had closed the gateway. But as he stood there, catching his breath, he realized that something was wrong, terribly wrong. He looked down at the metal disc in his hand. It was glowing faintly, pulsing with a strange energy. He looked around the room. The walls were gone, the roof was gone, and the entire camp had vanished. He was standing in a vast, empty plain under a dark and starless sky. He was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. He raised the disc and looked at it closely. He had closed the gateway, yes, but he hadn't stopped the darkness. He had merely transported it. The disc wasn't a key to closing the gate, it was a key to moving it. He looked down at the object and realized that this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. He was now responsible for transporting the gateway. The diary was gone, Reynolds was still missing, and the camp destroyed. He was the only one left who knew what had truly happened, and he was now standing in the middle of nowhere with an object of immense power in his hands. The same object that was now pulsing with dark energy, and a set of coordinates etched on its surface. Coordinates that seemed to be the next location for the gateway. The coordinates pointed to a place he recognized all too well. The coordinates of a small, quiet town, his hometown, a place called Havenwood.